Now it is time to say a very good morning to Helen Dale. Helen, a very good morning to you. How are you?
Morning, Mark. How are you?
Yeah,
It's a bit grim outside.
it's very grim outside, but it's sort of reflective, I think, of the slight hangover that everybody's got from feeling so joyous yesterday. I
Yesterday.
couldn't believe how excited people were getting, and I was kind of, I'm relatively calm about most things. I wasn't feeling it at all because I was thinking to myself, it's all very well and it's great that there's a vaccine, but this is a very long way away. And I think once again, the government kind of got the temperature of the country wrong by sort of making out that this was this fantastic thing. And almost as of tomorrow, we can all rest and relax.
Well, yes, you've got this awkward situation where no government on earth has the state capacity, even if they've got enough doses of the vaccine, to roll it out to their entire population quickly.
Right.
It has to be done in stages. And I thought you mentioned quite a lot about Australia earlier. I mean, and Australia is one of your sort of success story countries that's dealt with COVID exceptionally well. They're not starting their vaccine rollout, and they're like us. They've got a mixture of the different candidate vaccines, as well as one that was developed in Australia by Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, because Australia's got a good biotech industry as well. And they're not beginning their vaccine rollout until March next year.
Right. And so
And
that
there's been a
presumably,
few
and that will presumably be in the same kind of form as ours, which will be, care homes, the elderly, healthcare workers. So by the time it
I
reaches,
don't actually know. And the thing to watch with Australia is because it has really high state capacity, as in if the Australian government says it's going to do something, it will do it. It will be done properly. It will be effective. It will be really interesting to see what the federal government does in Australia and how they approach this, because they may do it differently. And there is a realistic possibility when you compare Australia to other countries around the world that if it is different, it may well be right. But of course, we don't know that in advance. All there's been is a little bit of reporting, because I still subscribe to the Australian, and I get their emails because I write for them as well, and I get their emails. All there's been is a few people having a little bit of a whinge
right.
about, oh, why is the UK so quick? And we're waiting until March. And Scott Morrison, to be fair to him, has responded pretty bluntly along the lines of, well, would you copy anything else they did?
Yeah, that's
And
not very comforting, is it? He has got a point.
He has got a point.
Yes, he really has. And I mean, what I'm interested in was I saw a picture, I think, just before the end of last week of an Aussie rules football match where there was 40,000 people in a stadium seemingly enjoying the sport, which they all do enjoy over there in mass numbers, even though I still don't really understand the game. You seem to be able to have no rules at all. But, they seem to have cracked herd immunity. They seem to have cracked getting COVID down to a very small number of cases and a very small, even smaller number of deaths. But have they done that at quite a great cost to the freedoms of the people?
Well, this is something that has to be honestly addressed with Australia. I mean, you were talking earlier about the idea of vaccine IDs. Now, Australia hasn't done that and is very unlikely to do so. But many of the ideas that are behind this notion of vaccine IDs, which is astonishingly stupid and going to be very difficult to implement in Britain for a whole range of reasons.
Right.
But a lot of the ideas about using vaccines as a tool of population control in this way, they come from an Australian policy that was introduced in 2015 when I was actually working in Canberra for an Australian parliamentarian. Not that I had anything to do with this policy. My boss was a crossbench senator, so he wasn't with either of the two big parties. But it's known as no jab, no pay. And basically what in Australia is like this, it keeps very detailed statistics about its people. It established that single mothers who didn't have very much money and conservative Muslims and Christians were, for different reasons, not getting their kids vaccinated. The first group, it was the general sort of problem of a chaotic, difficult to manage lifestyle associated with poverty.
Right.
And the second group, classic vaccine skepticism. If God meant me to put that in my body, he would put it in my body, that kind of thing. But then allied to that was another group of people who were overwhelmingly upper middle class and middle class using the British, not the American scale. And also dominated by women, who were vaccine skeptics, but in that sort of yoga, pure diet,
sort of organic
that
types.
kind of organic, greedy type stuff.
Right.
However, they were women from a social class who needed the Australian government's childcare subsidies. And so what the Australian government introduced was the no jab, no pay, which is, it didn't make vaccines compulsory, but it meant you couldn't get a childcare subsidy and you couldn't place your kids in what Australians call kindergarten,
Right.
which is historically there was a lot of German immigrants in Australia, which is why they use that phrase, which of course had a very dramatic effect on people who were vaccine refusers, and it largely fixed the problem.
Yeah.
But this is one of these Australian ideas that works because of Australia's high state capacity. It's carefully thought through because Australians are very good at policy detail. But just because of that doesn't mean you want to copy it in the United Kingdom. No. Not only because you may not have the skill to copy it, that's something realistically you have to state, but also because it's not very nice. It's putting your population into tiers, basically, while we're on the subject of tiers. It is extremely authoritarian. And this is one of those balancing acts. And I've talked about this in the past on the Independent Republic and in my journalism for multiple outlets, of how much authoritarianism is each saved life worth.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting point, because also, there's this thing called nudge politics, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. But where you get a situation where I think this government has to be careful with, where you appear to be kind of a bit overbearing and you appear to be trying to sort of shame people into doing something. People resist that. Certainly in this country, they don't like being told that you're doing something wrong by not doing what we're telling you, and therefore you will need to be punished in some way. I mean, in America, for example, lots of kids get diagnosed with ADHD because it's one of the things that they like to do over there. And if you suffer from ADHD in America, if your child suffers from it, you will not be allowed to put that child into a public school, a state school, unless the child is then given Ritalin. And that is a huge infringement on people's rights. But in America, which is much more conscious of rights than we are, they deal with it and they take it and they do what they're told.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, where people do and don't obey the state or trust the state varies enormously, even within liberal democracies. You only have to see the incomprehension from people in the United States when they're trying to write intelligently about France.
Yeah.
And they just don't understand that France is also a liberal democracy, but it doesn't have the same liberal democratic rules that the United States does, because it is France and it has different history.
Right.
And Britain is the same and Australia is the same. But the nudge unit, which is copying some of the no jab, no pay ideas, is, if there is a government quango, I mean, it's called the Behavioural Insights Team now. I mean, I personally think they should all be scuppered because of their disco stew graphs and having the National Statistics Authority having to get up and say all that information you used to justify that lockdown was just bad sums.
Right.
You know, when it's reached that point that you've got a serious problem. But if there is a quango that needs to be fired into the sun, it is your Behavioural Insights Team.
Yes.
And I will come on the Independent Republic and discuss this book once the review is published. But I'm in the process of writing a review of this book, Science Fictions, by a chap called Stuart Ritchie.
Okay.
And he's a psychologist, and the poor lad, I actually met him, I knew him when he used to work up in Edinburgh, has had to deal in his profession, in his job, with all the studies historically that the nudge unit and the Behavioural Insights Team relied upon, including to give policy advice, and I suspect motivating some of the policy advice now because of Nadine Zahawi's background as a very Cameron-era MP. The studies that these arguments are based on, none of them replicate. Now, that's a technical term. It literally means you get the same set of figures and the same information, but applied to and the same claims applied to different groups of people. And can you get the same effect, basically? Right. Do the same findings pop out at the end?
Yes.
And this chap, Stuart Ritchie, was one of the people who was first started to go, hang on, That doesn't replicate.
No.
That's just
So it doesn't.
nothing.
In other words, it doesn't work.
It doesn't mean nothing.
And this is the trouble. I mean, anything that was started by David Cameron, as a nudge unit was, is almost bound to be absolutely worthless and useless, and as you say, should be fired into the sun. But interestingly, as well, you have everything now judged on the basis of research. I mean, if I hear anybody saying it, I immediately sort of start twitching. And as I did the other day when I heard some woman talking about the effect of air pollution in cities, and how everybody knows that research has proven that children who are suffering from air pollution become obese and are overweight because they suffer from anxiety, and so they eat more. And I'm going, where is this research coming from? You know, at which point did that become a fact? It became a fact when you commissioned some research to tell you what you wanted to hear.
Well, the problem with that, and Richie's book, I haven't read all of it yet, I'm only about halfway through, but Richie's book goes into the people making causal claims for things or trying to establish a relationship of causality, sometimes where there isn't even a correlation, but often there might be a correlation, but they are trying to connect the two, cause and effect, is impossible, or it just simply hasn't been done. And I understand his book goes into a lot more detail about this, the problems of people imputing causal relationships where they don't exist.
Right.
And I mean, here's one that's an obvious example, and I'll pick on across the pond because over here the picture is much more complex. In the United States, there are very significant outcome differences between white and Asian Americans in terms of their academic achievement and their employment, and African Americans. This is extremely well documented. Everyone acknowledges it. Now, you've got a significant group of people, your classic anti-racist crew, who try to attribute all of that to racism, to discrimination in the workplace and things like that. And then when you tease apart their argument, you find they have no data.
Right.
There is nothing to show that there is actually broad-scale discrimination, particularly in employment, against African Americans.
Well, because you can't actually measure that, can you? I mean, you can measure the numbers. You can measure the numbers of people. You
can, but it's very hard. And you should not be making confident claims like that about a causal relationship without looking at all sorts of other, what statisticians call confounding variables.
Right.
You know, of which there are many in the US. You know, like how many people have firearms is an obvious one that British people think of, but also the way the police work, and it varies from state to state. You know, all of these kind of things, that what crime rates are, you know, all of these things. You know, so monocausal explanations are really popular, and they're nearly always wrong. Yes,
and unfortunately, we seem to be being governed by a group of people who are reliant more and more on that kind of data. The kind of data which, as you say, illustrates something, but it's very difficult to tell exactly what.
And you just have to be very cautious and much more modest and much more humble about your claims. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Nassim Taleb's paper that he tweeted at me of the difficulty of trying to forecast things in complex systems.
Yeah.
And coronavirus is one of those things, which is why all the epidemiological graphs have been so terrible.
Yeah.
But it's not just that. It's why the Bank of England got all its Brexit forecasts wrong.
Right.
It's the same problem.
Yeah.
You know, you just need to be a lot more humble about this kind of thing. You know, forecasters and pollers can do quite well when it's one single discrete thing. Like the pollers did a good job of the 2019 general election, for example, over here. The pollsters and the super forecasters did a good job of picking when there would be vaccines for coronavirus, because it's a single spot event in time. But trying to do it for something that's large and complicated and all of these moving parts is incredibly difficult to do. And you just need to be so much more humble
but I suppose
when you make
the
those
problem,
kind of claims.
Yeah, but I suppose the problem for the government and why they rely so heavily on the science that they call science, even though you and I probably don't call it science, is that without that, they have really no justification for doing anything. Because if they didn't have the graphs and they didn't have Jonathan Van Tam with his slides, you know, and they were making this kind of policy, I guess people would say quite rightly to them, on what basis are you doing this? So they've sort of got to show you something, haven't they?
Well, the thing is, they're using the scientists as a shield. And I'm sure the scientists must know this.
Yeah.
But the problem is, and one of the points Stuart Ritchie makes in his book is, all those overhyped scientific studies about like red wine or sugar in your diet and all of that kind of thing. I always blamed, and admittedly he admits this too, used to blame the university or company's press department for being overconfident about their claims. But he's done a lot of research, and there's a whole chapter in his book on it, where it turns out that a lot of the worst offenders are actually scientists themselves.
Yes. Well, so
it's not just the politicians using them as a human shield. They're happy to be used in that way themselves.
No, until we had this coronavirus pandemic, mostly the job of the chief medical officer of this country was to give stories to the Daily Telegraph to tell you those exact words about one glass of red wine is enough for you for the whole year, and don't have any more than that or else you get cancer. That was usually the area that they were in.
Yes, don't eat steak or overcooked steak or barbecues or whatever.
Right.
It would change every week. I mean, there's a chap at the IEA, Chris Snowden, who calls himself a lifestyle economist, which I quite like. It's quite amusing.
Yes.
But he literally just collects stories like this and then tweets them out or puts them in articles for various magazines and newspapers. And you just sit there, and the advice, red wine is good, suddenly it's bad, then it's good again. Fat is bad, then it's good, and then sugar is bad and sugar is good. And it's just you're sitting there going, this is not public health, this is just silliness.
But mind you, soon enough, hopefully, at some point in the next 12 months, we'll be getting back to that. And it will seem like a pleasant and welcome relief after all this madness, won't it?
Well, you would think so, but it's just, I mean, the point about, I'm going to give the Drakeford in Wales a slap about this. The official Welsh Labour policy is still to be opposed to identity cards. After Tony Blair and David Blunkett got beaten up badly in 2004 for wanting to introduce them. And this is another example of them pinching an idea from Australia that didn't even run in Australia. I mean, I remember seeing spray paint on overpasses as a girl. You've already got an identity. You don't need a card.
Right.
Fight the un-Australian Australia card. And it was gotten rid of. It was fought off. But so you've got Welsh Labour saying we're opposed to ID cards. They learnt their lesson. They got very badly burnt when Blair was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they're in favour of COVID ID. And the point is, it is exactly the same thing. You cannot hold these two things in your head at the same time without doing serious cognitive damage to yourself. And the Welsh administration has been horribly authoritarian. I mean, it started with the closing all the independent bookstores down. So the only place you could get books was basically Amazon, and until one Welsh bookshop finally got online and organised itself. So you could see it with that. And you're just thinking, no, the people who are doing this are really petty. And now it's the shutting the pubs at 6 and not letting them serve any alcohol. That's not to do with COVID. That's to do with the historical tendency of Labour in some of these, in the devolved nations, to effectively be an arm of the historic temperance movement.
Yes. Which I find baffling. I really do. But listen,
yes, it's baffling.
We're out of time, sadly, Helen, again. But thank you very much indeed for talking to us. It is weird, isn't it, how almost all of these people in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and even here in the UK as a whole, with Boris Johnson and his government, they seem to want to shut pubs all the time. What is that all about? I was in a pub yesterday, as I said earlier, talking to the guy that owns it, and he was asking the same questions. I don't understand what they've got against pubs, and that's obviously what they have got something against. It doesn't make any sense.